and away you go.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. It's so great to have y'all here with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And tonight we're going to be talking about container gardens or container gardening. Let me see, my slide isn't advancing. So last week we talked about plants to attract our favorite birds. This week we're going to be talking about container gardening with native plants. Next week we'll go over how to attract birds by the season and what things they need depending on the season and where they are in their migration or breeding journey. And then finally we will wrap up with creating mini habitats in your outdoor spaces. We have today's agenda. We will be going over the Plants for Birds database. I'm not sure how many of y'all have used it before, but it's a really awesome tool. It's pretty exciting to use. I know I love it. I love watching or seeing the pictures that pop up. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can have that in my yard. That's awesome. So we'll go over that in just a little bit and also how to fine tune your plant list from using the database. We will also go over container gardening with native, I keep saying that, container gardening with native plants, but in terms of knowing your space, like all of the things you should keep in mind when you're planning your container garden, including layers, what your thrillers, spillers, and fillers are, and what some really good choices are for each layer that we recommend. We will also have scheduled breaks for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. And if you're not shy, go ahead and just leave it set to everyone and we will get to that question. If you have a question that you'd rather not know everybody else, or rather not have everybody else know that you asked, feel free to to chat myself, Ken, or Leslie. These are our names. So you can find us. You just go to the blue everyone button and then you can select our name. And if there's too many people on there to select, I think there's a search bar so you can actually type in the name and it'll pop up. All right, so we will get started. I'm just gonna minimize my video. I don't like looking at myself when I talk. So one of the most important things when it comes to planting is knowing your space. Think about how much of it you want to dedicate to your container garden. Do you just want to have one container? Would you like to have many? Those are things to keep in mind because if it's something where you want to have one planter, you may want to have a larger planter and have different plants in there. You may want to have a single plant species in each container if you're doing something that's a little bit more spread out. It's a really great opportunity to be creative with what you want to see in your yard or in your outdoor space. And before selecting your final plant list, you'll need to get a sense of your space's constraints and advantages. For plants, a major determining factor is, of course, sunlight. Since we're picking or choosing native plants, we don't have to worry as much about if it's a wet area or a dry area, but you should definitely keep those things in mind when you're selecting your plants. You don't want to group plants together that this one likes to be a little bit more dry and this one likes to be, moist at all times. So I think it's good to pick a day and the time that you can actually observe your space to see exactly how much sunlight different areas receive. I actually did not realize how much sunlight I had that I was working with. I recently started some plants. I'm hoping to have a container garden myself. And I was just like, oh yeah, it's great. It's sunny outside all the time. It's actually not sunny outside all the time. I actually need to go out and move my plants just because they're seedlings. And so it's good to know how the sun is moving across the sky and what areas you're going to be getting sun and not. This is especially important if you live in a dense area with tall buildings or fences that could block the sun or trees that could block the sun. You want to think about those things when you're designing your garden. And then also think about how you use the space and what you want the container gardens to do. If it's something that you are planting your container garden to attract more birds for you to view, then you may not want to put it right next to where you're going to be sitting outside and like noisily chatting, because the birds may not want to come around then. That's not necessarily true for all birds, but some birds don't want to be that close to people. So that's something to keep in mind. And now I'm going to take you on a tour of our Plants for Birds database. Let me just pull up my window. It's not pulling up. I'm sorry, y'all. We're experiencing a little minor technical difficulty.
Might have to escape out of PowerPoint and then be able to switch the screen. Might help you out there.
Okay. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen just for a moment. And
we had a few people join us late that if you'd like to find your way to the chat box and share what your favorite native plant that is blooming right now is, would be a great way to share what you're seeing outside and your tastes and blooms outside. It's great to share too.
okay, can everybody see my screen with the Bring More Birds to Your Home with Native Plants? I can't see y'all because my actually. Can you see?
Yes, you're fine. Yep.
Great.
We can see it, Julian.
Thank you. So this is the homepage of our native plants database, and you can enter your email in here. To have the website work, you don't have to enter your email, but it's really great. This is my email if anybody ever wants to email me. It's really great to put it in because you'll be able to have the plants that you've selected emailed to you, so you have that list handy. I have already put in my zip code here. I'm here in Hamden, Connecticut. And let's go to search and see what it pulls up for us. I love that when I first log into this, it tells me what my nearest Audubon offering native plant services is. For me, that is the Connecticut Audubon Society in Guilford. I'm sure some of y'all know them, Dennis. And if I were to just leave it how it is without customizing anything at all, it would give me plants that are native to my zip, like just based off of my zip code, which is really awesome. And it also will tell me what bird species that particular plant might attract. As you can see, alternate leaf dogwood is like a huge attractant. Like it's the end all be all plant to have if you have space for it in your outdoor space. And it also will tell you what attributes it has, like if it's a shrub or a tree, or if it's in both categories. It bears fruit, it attracts butterflies and caterpillars, which is probably why it's attracting all of these birds as well. It will tell you about how tall the plant is. It'll tell you the light requirements. That's not exclusive. It doesn't do that for all plants, but it especially will do that if it's something that you should take note of when you're selecting that plant. So we are going to go through and try to find something for my zip code where I'm living here. And as you can see here, depending on what type of plant you want, you can select annuals, grasses, succulents, shrubs, trees, vines, evergreen. With the fact that we're doing container gardens in mind, I'm going to select annuals and perennials, some grasses, and maybe even a vine. Okay, and if we go to all plant resources, I would like to select nectar, butterflies, caterpillars, and seeds. I'm not selecting nuts because it would be difficult to have a plant that would grow a nut in a container garden. So I won't do that for this one. But if that's something that you're wanting to use the database for another outdoor space where you can plant something that is large enough to grow nuts, then by all means, go back and check that. I'm actually going to leave this blank for now. I'm perfectly happy to attract any type of bird to my space. And as you can see, it's no longer the alternate leaf dogwood up here. I have a new list. So I have an option of anise scented goldenrod, black-eyed Susan. I love black-eyed Susan, so I'm going to select that. And it's telling me about how tall it'll be. In 1 to 2 feet, full sun, moist to dry, well-drained soil. That's a great height to put into a container garden. It also is telling me that it blooms June through October. So when I go to print out my list, I can keep tabs on when different things are blooming to make sure I have something in my containers that's always going and interesting to look at. So I've added that to my plant list. Bluebell of Scotland, another awesome, awesome plant. This can grow in full shade or full sun. And I really just love purple flowers, so I'm going to add that. Oh wait, I'm noticing here it says that this plant will germinate quickly, but it takes 2 years for them to flower. I do not have the patience, so I'm going to uncheck that. See you later, Bluebell of Scotland. Butterfly milkweed is another great one. Ken and I were talking earlier, and he mentioned that this particular plant in a container, it might need something that's a little bit more well-drained. And so I'm not going to select that one right now. Scrolling through, cardinal flower, awesome. Select that. I love hummingbirds. And it'll be in bloom midsummer to fall. That's great. All right, I won't keep y'all too long on this. And there, as you can see, there's pages. You can go forever looking through and figuring out which plants you want. I might do one more. I'll do Farewell Summer. This is a really awesome aster to add to your group. It won't get as large as some of the other native asters like New England aster. Okay, so I have my plants, and if I'm curious, oh, okay, I can get some grosbeaks, wrens, nuthatches, great. You can go to buy now. I'm not ready to buy now. I would like to get my plant list. So down here, you'll see this red button that says get your plant list. And I'll have my work email address in here. Okay. Awesome. Now that I've used the native plant list or database, it has sent me this list here that I have. And that list will include the plant name, like the common name, and also the scientific name, which is really important when you're thinking about getting native plants, because there are so many different plant species out there that have the same common name, and you want to make sure that you're getting the one that is native to your area. So it's good to take down that scientific name when you're going to a nursery, or even ordering, if you order from a wholesaler or something like that online, if you've got a big yard. And it also will put out to the side what it may attract. And if I ever am just like, oh my goodness, what did I do? I can copy and paste this link and it'll show you what happens. It's literally the same page over again. And the cool thing about this list is you can add on to it. It's not set in stone. So I can go and say, oh, you know what? I want to add something else onto this list. I can go back and continue adding and it'll update for me. It also will give you local resources for where you can get your native plants. I know that can be a challenge for some people. They're like, I don't know where to get a native plant. I want one, but where do I go? And so we'll include the site links for that. Our Audubon centers have native plant sales. We also have nurseries that we've researched. I would recommend that, especially now, that you reach out to the nursery in advance to make sure that they're open, or if they have a special policy about how you can pick up your plants, or if there have been any delays, because I know we're all trying to stay distant and safe and healthy. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. There are also some online retailers as well that you can look at. And then at the bottom of the page, there are great articles that you can read through, articles and blog posts that Audubon has shared. Okay, so now I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to bring us back to my presentation. Bear with me one moment, please. Okay. So now that we have done our database tour, what are some of the plants that you're hoping, or the birds that you're hoping to attract? Do you have things in your container that'll bloom no matter the season? Actually, I'm realizing I'm not sharing my, there we go. Sorry about that, y'all. All the new things that I'm getting to do now that we're in times of stress. Okay, here we go. So after the presentation on the database, did y'all have any questions for us? If you do, feel free to put them into the questions box. And if there are any questions already there, Leslie or Ken, feel free to let me know.
No questions at the moment.
Okay. We'll keep moving along. So let's go over some things to keep in mind when we're planting a container garden. Then we'll take a look at some of the plants that we would recommend to get you started. This is Teresa Carter Wotring of Baltimore, Maryland. This photo was shared courtesy of Patterson Park Audubon Center. And she has shared or dedicated 50% of her patio to native plants. So she doesn't have a yard, she only has a patio. And look how lush and green and beautiful it is out there. Similar to the way that nature layers itself, think about creating layers with your container gardens, both within the container itself. You can have a lovely tall centerpiece with some filler around it, and then a little bit of something that can maybe be dripping off of the side, or just a little bit lower height plant. That way it keeps everything interesting visually for you, and also for the birds and pollinators that may be coming to visit your container garden. Aesthetics. We want you to design for your eyes. You're already selecting native plants, and so that's going to be great for wildlife, but we want for you to enjoy your container garden. It's something that you're going to be looking at and caring for, so we want you to also enjoy it. Maybe you want to have bright flowers, or maybe you want to have a more minimalist style. Perhaps you want to have something that can screen out your neighbors. I know if you can see this box here with the ferns in it, I have a friend who has used something like this just to block out his neighbor. Like, it's a huge pocket planter that he's created that blocks out his neighbor's view. So you can do all kinds of fun things with it. And you can grow multiple plants in the same spot, in the same pot, like I was mentioning earlier, or you can keep it simple and only have one species per pot. A good principle for designing beautiful individual containers is thriller, filler, spiller. And Ken will be going over that in just a bit. But the idea is to pick something that's showy to put in the middle, like I was saying, and then to have some fun things around, like with really cool foliage types, just in case it's something that maybe isn't in bloom, but you can still look at the beautiful and different leaves that are around. And then another good tip is to actually just reach out to your local nursery and see if they have any good ideas for combinations that really shine in your area. I know that can be a bit daunting to people to say, like, oh, which ones should I put together? Excuse me. So we're going to go through some that we would recommend, but definitely check in with folks too and see if they have any other ideas for you. Don't forget to strategize when you're picking your container. You can put your garden in a terracotta pot. You can put it in a bucket. I've seen people use tires. I've seen people use old kitchen pots even. All you just need to do is make sure that it can aerate, so having holes in the sides, and then also drain, so having holes on the bottom. but anything could be a good container. I've even seen people use old bathtubs, like clawfoot bathtubs, and those are really cool too. So let your creativity just flow. Okay, I wanted to go over some do's and don'ts with you before we swap over. Do plant in the springtime or in the fall. It's the same as when you are planting for any other outdoor space that maybe isn't in a container. Follow the planting instructions. Definitely use mulch. Containers will dry out a lot more quickly than you would think, especially if they're put in a place where there's full sun. So you want to make sure that you are trying to keep as much moisture in there as possible. And mulch is a really great way to do that, especially if you have any bare soil. If you have, which you probably will have early on, ideally your spillers that we're going to get to will take over that, and you won't need to mulch as much moving forward. Making sure you water. When you first plant, just keep a really close eye on how your plants are doing with their water and like how the pot is doing or the container is doing with its moisture levels, and adjust from there. Once you learn that, you'll be all set. And again, making sure you have your drainage holes. Do not use garden soil if you can help it, or if you must use a garden soil, then it's just easier to not. I was going to go through what to do if you want to use your garden soil. Potting soil is really great because it has all of the different things in it that will help to keep that soil aerated and also help to keep the soil moist without packing down. You don't want your soil to be too heavy on the roots of your plant. That can stress your plants, and then you won't have a successful container. And nobody wants that. Don't be afraid to stake your tall plants. When you have tall plants in there, give them a little bit of support. Never hurts. And also, same idea as the garden soil. Don't pat down the soil after you scoop it into the pot, because loose soil is easier on your plant roots. And now I have a poll that I'm going to be sharing with you. In just one moment. Poll, okay. Hopefully everybody can see this poll. And if for some reason you can't see it, I have the question listed out here to the left on the slide of how much of your outdoor space would you dedicate to native plants? You can put that in the chat if you're not able to access the poll.
I think we might.
Oh, I think I put the wrong one. I'm sorry. I'm actually going to. So we'll take about 30 more seconds to answer this poll. Wow, that's awesome. I'm hoping that by the end of this series that we will have many more people leaning towards having many more native plants in their yards. So thank you for that. I'm going to end this poll. And I don't know if I ever shared the results so that y'all could see them. Most people do have 4 to 8 different species in their outdoor spaces, which is awesome. Okay, and now I'm going to share the other poll.
Can you get to that, Jillian?
There we go. Can everybody see it?
Yes, and I just posted it in the chat box if you did not have the wording on your screen.
Awesome. I am super excited about all the people who are saying that they would dedicate all of their space to native plants. Okay, 5 more seconds for anybody to So wants to answer? Okay. This is fantastic. So we have the majority of people saying they would dedicate up to 50% of their outdoor space for native plants, which is fantastic. That's also what Doug Tallamy recommends when we're thinking about native plants. So that's just really, really great. I'm super excited to see that. Okay. Now I'm going to hand it over to Ken to take us through some of the plants that we're going to have as options for our container gardens.
Thanks there, Jillian. First, there was a question that just popped in a moment ago, and then of course, as I changed screens, I lost the question. So Leslie, if you wouldn't mind asking that question on Esther's behalf and possibly answering it for us.
This is the one about the potting soil?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, can you reuse the potting soil and containers from the previous year? So technically, you can use it, but the real question is, should you reuse it? And the should is, no, you probably shouldn't. And that's because the plants that you had the previous year or the soil that's been sitting over the winter in your containers can have diseases or fungus in the soils from the plants or from leaving it sitting around. So technically you should not use the same potting soil over and over again. You should buy fresh potting soil. And one of the things that Jillian was just talking about is how the soil is light, not to pat it down a lot. A lot of times if the potting soil is old and it's been sitting in the pot, it gets compacted. One of the things in potting soil is a vermiculite, which is an exploded mica, and that helps keep air spaces and in the soil and water moving through the soil.
Great. Thanks, Leslie.
Sure.
So we have a small list going of some plants that I'm going to break it down into the ideas of thrillers, fillers, and spillers, and some of them bridge the ideas. And I tried to choose plants that are going to obviously attract birds and insects, but also that they could survive in a container on their own, or that they could be a good neighbor in a container with other plants. So the idea of small is relative compared depending on what size container you have. So I've tried to choose some things that are inches tall and some things that are just a foot or two in height as well. And some of those first ones, we're going to go one by one, so you won't lose these names because we're going to go over them along with their Latin names in just a moment. But a few of them that we can see lots of bright colors. I could have come up with a few white ones as well that at the end of each section, I might throw out some other ideas. That rattlesnake master and mountain mint were two that I really considered putting on this list as well. One of our favorite little flowers growing at the Audubon Center at Stratford Point in our native plant garden there is the blazing stars. Sometimes they can be white blooms rather than pink, and they are a midsummer bloom. They do like a lot of full sun because they are native to growing out in the middle of our meadows. Most of this plant list are perennials, so when we have the question of should we reuse the potting soil or not, that is a question we can bring up a little bit later on, is possibly rediscuss how do you set up a container for perennials versus having it as something that we replace on a regular basis. One great thing about blazing star is that they are narrow, which in a container can be an important factor sometimes. Many of us love those white with the dark red bleeding hearts. There is also a very delicate pinkish purple wild native species. Most of your garden centers might call it the fringed bleeding heart. And one thing I love about bleeding heart is that when it's not in bloom, it's got those beautiful, delicately cut foliage around it as well. They are a late spring bloom. I think one person actually already listed as one of their favorite plants to add that's in bloom right now. They're relatively short, only 12 to 18 inches tall. You know, when we think of things like Joe Pyeweed and ironweed, that's taller than me usually. So having some nice small plants that can, and this one also tolerates a fair bit of shade compared to some of our other choices that you might have. So if you've got a more shady part of your patio that your container's on, this is one that will still survive without full sun. One that does like full sun, and you might hear it offered different ways, are the monardas. Our wild bergamot, the one that is native to our wild meadows, is the light purple on the left. And you can see its Latin name there, Monarda fistulosa. And that prefers a drier setting that I'm usually the type that forgets to water my plants. So I try to choose a lot that could be a little bit more foolproof in the format that they are relatively drought tolerant species. Of course, when we're transplanting and it's their first season in, I think everything needs a little bit more attention. But these are, a lot of them are plants that could deal with being dried out a little bit. So the bergamots can grow in a sandier soil, but they do well with others around. And the red bee balm, is one that attracts lots of different insects. That is a clear winged snowberry moth, also known as a butterfly moth, drinking out of that nectar just as well as a hummingbird does. And both of these will only grow to that 2 to 3 foot tall range. So they can do fairly well as a center part of an average size container. They also have a lot of small insects that will feed on the leaves that it's amazing when I take summer campers out looking for insects, how many other things we'll find besides butterflies on these small plants. Other people today mentioned that wild columbine blooming is one of their favorite things to see right now. It's a late spring bloom. Sometimes it's a little sooner than we expect. It's another nectar source for our hummingbirds, and it can also survive in a shady condition, not full shade, but it can deal with that condition. And it's also deer tolerant, that our deer don't immediately prefer it. So it has a chance of surviving if that's a challenge in your yard as well. It is a relatively, once it's done blooming, it goes to seed and the plant does not stick around. So that is one consideration, is that you'll definitely want some other fillers and some other later blooming flowers around it. And one of those that we're thinking of just a hummingbird attracting planter, start with the columbine and then make sure there's some cardinal flower included, because that will start blooming not long after the columbine in many conditions. It too only grows 2, maybe 3 feet tall usually here in the Northeast. Maybe if it's in a really great condition, it might get up to 4 feet. And it can also deal with a few hours of shade as well. If we're thinking of cardinal flower, I don't know, some years, right as I see the hummingbirds really getting to it, it fades out and goes to seed already. And what do we have that grows very similar to it that will bloom later into the summer, well past our hummingbirds staying around into mid-September and sometimes early October? An interesting idea that when I talk to my butterfly attracting friends is to consider a non-native but not invasive plant is a pineapple sage. And we notice how similar they are. We also have a native sage. If you want to stick with 100% native plants, there is the lyre-leafed sage. And I did check plant lists, and there are some of our native plant nurseries around do have this on their plant list at the moment. So the sage leaf, the lyre-leafed sage is another option. It's a lighter purple, but it is a tubular flower. And it brings me to the idea that other herbs can be included as well, that while they're not all native, they are great at being a host plant for many of our insects. And certainly when they're in bloom, the pollinators always love them. wanted to take a quick moment. People always ask, well, if I only had to get one plant, what would it be? And if you have a planter and you want just one thing in it, something small that's under control, but is going to provide for pollinators and will provide for a host plant for caterpillars and provide some other food source for birds along the way. One thing would be a low bush blueberry. You heard us last week talk about high bush blueberry. Well, this one only grows usually about 2 feet tall, maybe knee high. And it also has that amazing purple foliage in the fall. So it's got a lot of different aesthetic value to it, not just with having those white flowers now in the late spring and those berries through the summer. It's got some other characteristics to keep it interesting throughout the season. When we think of the plants that attract the most number of pollinators, Joe Pyeweed is right up there at the top of all of Doug Tallamy's research, along with mountain mint. The problem with Joe Pyeweed, most of you realize, is that it grows taller than any of us. There is a species, though, the dubium species for Joe Pyeweed is a dwarf variety that grows 2 to 3 feet tall. I was reading up on it today because it is actually sold through some of our native plant nurseries, even ones that consider only native plants to the Northeast. They are selling it. I don't know how many they might have around still, but they do sell this dwarf variety, and it was accidentally found at a nursery in eastern Pennsylvania. So it may have been brought in, it may be a cultivar, but it's now a naturalized separate species that they consider it to be. And the pollinators on it are absolutely amazing. In mountain mint, have a white flower. I know that when I planted it at different gardens for senior centers and for schools, I pull the plant out of the car, it's in bloom, I put it down, and by the time I come back with the next plant out of the back of my car, there's already some pollinator on this. It's absolutely amazing. They grow in clumps, and yes, they will grow out over the next couple of years, but to start that first year, they usually stick to the size that they are. And it is amazing how late into the season they might bloom some years as well. Any questions about the thriller type plants or that conversation spilling over from creating a container to begin with and the soil types and things?
So Ken, there's a question about keeping chipmunks out of containers.
After seeing the patio of one of my colleagues, I highly suggest getting a pet weasel. Chipmunks seem to be a preferred food for a weasel family at a friend's back patio. But no, I don't have a great answer for that. I don't know if somebody else in the group might be able to suggest something about keeping the chipmunks out physically.
So one thing that I think of, if you don't want to have a physical barrier, like a chicken wire or something like that, I see a cat. The cats will eat the birds. We don't want the cats to eat the birds. You could try sprinkling kitty litter down. I've heard that works. I haven't personally tried it, but I have heard that sprinkling kitty litter on top of the soil can help with that. And also using cayenne pepper. I know there are some suets out there that you put in your suet feeder that people will use cayenne to keep squirrels from eating their suet because it bothers the squirrels, but it doesn't bother the birds. So that's also maybe an option for keeping them from doing that. I know I have a gray squirrel that lives in my yard named Honey who likes to dig up my tick seed plant. But the way that it grows, it always grows back, so I don't mind it so much. But good question. Thanks, Anita.
That's a good question. There's been a few questions about refreshing the potting soil and using perennials as annuals versus keeping them in the pots. I'm happy to take that, but if you guys want to, that's fine.
Love to hear what you have to say about it.
Okay, so the back to what we were talking about with the soil before, and Ken was talking about refreshing the soil, that is something that you can do with your perennials if you keep them from year to year in the pots. You just lift them out gently in March or very early April before they come up too much, and you can shake them out and almost have them as bare root plants and then replant them after you've put fresh soil in. Or you can just take some of the soil that's around those plants and scoop out the old and put in the new. If the perennials are in there, they're pretty hardy. Their roots, some of the roots are fine, but there'll be enough roots at the beginning of the growing season to actually continue to grow. So that's how you can refresh the potting soil, or you can start over with brand new potting soils if you've lifted them out. And you can either treat them as annuals and then move them or give them away and have someone put them in the garden, or you can keep them from year to year. You just need to protect the planters so that they're not impacted too much by freezing and thawing cycles and flooded by frozen snow and ice in them over the winter. So it's a little tricky to keep them, and you certainly don't want to put them in a basement where they can dry out too much. So they can be shorter lived if they are not taken care of properly, but if you do take care of them properly, then they can last from year to year.
Thank you.
If there's any other ones, I think that hits most of the questions. If I missed anything, type it back in.
Ooh. So a fun idea is the idea of fillers, and that might lead to somebody's question of, do we put one of each type of plant into a container, or do we need multiples of a certain type of plant? And having multiples does help with cross-pollination, that insects go from one plant to another. So it would, if you want your plants to be producing seeds, that you might be able to collect some and grow your own the next year, you might want your plants to be pollinating across rather than just from one plant. Might also help with them being able to produce a seed enough so that they can feed our birds as well. So a couple of crazy ideas I had were some plants that may also be considered spillers in some aspects. I looked at some ways that we might consider native plants as ground covers. And then also, if you've got a larger planter, quite often it's grasses. And our native grasses sometimes are not as well behaved in this situation. So I've got some caveats with each of these, but I just wanted to pass along a few. And then I do want to address the idea of ferns, because it's a great different texture, but biologically it has a different idea for attracting insects and things. So one of those that I was looking at is blue-eyed grass. I personally have never found it more than a foot tall, but other people might find it in other forms as well. Also, when I say blue-eyed grass, it's not a grass, it's actually an iris. So it's going to have a specific bloom in the late spring, this beautiful little blue with the yellow centers. I almost always picture seeing this in picturing palm warblers and other migrating warblers that land on the ground around it. It's just an image I have in my head of them. They will spread a little bit, so you might want to plant a few of them around, but they will certainly fill in around as they go along, because other people do use them as ground covers, and not only in full sun situations, but they can take a partial shade and tolerate that as well. If you are looking for a shadier condition, one thing to consider is wild ginger. And on one of the lists that I read, other people were suggesting that this could even become your spiller. But I think that's for someone who's thinking of a permanent container with natives in it, that they do spread by rhizomes. So it would take a while, but they have a unique, different type of flower. This is an extreme close-up, but it's just so cool of a flower in my opinion. They do need a richer soil, so you probably might going to be needing to add some compost or a leaf mulch, not regular mulch, to your container for this. But I love the heart-shaped leaves and dark green through most of the summer. It's just a gorgeous plant in my opinion. And those roots, it will die back at the end of the season, but those roots, the perennial, will be there and it will sprout up again the next season, is one thing I want to consider. Another interesting choice that can tolerate the shade and also tolerate deer is Christmas fern. You might find some other fern possibilities out there. Most of our native ferns are not going to attract a lot of insects. They might support areas for things to hide, but it's not usually a great choice for a lot of them to want to eat from. So it would be a great different texture to have. Christmas fern, one thing that people like about it is that it's evergreen. So if this is a planter that will be outside in your yard, but in a protected area, it will last. It does like a similar soil to wild ginger, but just make sure that it's well drained, that its only maintenance issue is that if it gets too wet on a regular consistency, it can't have a rotting issue. But otherwise, it will also keep one clump. That clump will grow more leaves, but it won't actually spread all over the place. So it can be a great plant to have. And maybe it won't be a container for you, but if you have a shady part of your garden, this is a great plant to consider as well. Then for sunnier areas, absolute full sun is needed for little blue stems. Out of our native grasses, it is one that will only grow 2, maybe sometimes 4 feet tall, but being in a container, maybe it won't have that condition that it wants to grow to its full potential height. I love the plant. I think I recommended it last week as well because of its fall color, having some different interest that people always think of grasses as being either green or tan. So having something that produces a maroon color, almost purplish at times, and the seed heads are really valuable for those sparrows, those juncos, and goldfinches coming through your yard as well. It might not be for a container for you, but it also is a great option if you're considering a rain garden situation as well. Another one that grows a little bit taller is switchgrass. The descriptions will always tell you it grows to about 3 feet. And then the flowers pieces on top might actually grow taller than that. But I love how thin and feathery it might look at times. It also has a great fall color. And the one reason why I recommend it is that it is a native grass that can tolerate both wet and dry conditions. So rain garden conditions or a being in a planter in a container where it could get inundated with a rainstorm, but also it might dry out because we went away on vacation. This is a pretty tolerant plant of a lot of different conditions. Another pretty grass is the purple love grass. And I had to look this up. It probably isn't on a lot of people's nurseries wish lists, but it's a shorter grass, only 1 to 2 feet tall. It's a clump grass, but it doesn't spread by rhizomes like a lot of the other grasses. Instead, it's that if the stems reach the ground, it will node and regrow from the stems touching the ground. So I mention this because you can control how much this spreads by how much you let it retouch the ground and things. It's another full sun preferred plant. It also does like it to be drier, so overwatering it could be an issue. But I want to show you the up close, these really light purple little seed heads. It's so pretty at times that there are people who actually consider it for dried flower arrangements. So just wanted to add that in there as a different style of plant choices. There was a little bit of conversation there. Is there a question or two before we move on?
There is one question that I missed the last time, but it's a great question. And you all may be covering this later on. It's about grouping or staggering plants either in planters or in the garden for impact. Whether planting multiples of the same plant or staggering them through the garden is a good idea.
Right, I just barely touched on that before. For the health of the plant so that there's cross-pollination and for the plants to fill in around themselves. In a garden situation, we usually say buy in clumps of 3 usually for most of our suggested things. For a container, it's that this is an aesthetic value and you have your limiting factor is the amount of space you have. So some of these plants we might be going on a more individual basis. It also depends on what size plant you're able to purchase, whether you're buying plugs from a native nursery or you're buying it already in a 6-inch pot. You might have multiple stems already of that plant. Anything to add there, Jillian or Leslie, on that topic?
I was just going to say the exact same thing, that if it's in the garden, definitely clumps are better. It gives a variety for pollinators and for birds to flap about to try their favorite meals versus just having the one option. And then even for a container, just as Ken was saying, it depends on the size of the container. If your container is large enough that would allow you to have more than one in there, I say go for it. But if not, then you can always either have a second container or just keep it minimalist. If that answers the question. Did you have anything to add to that, Leslie? Sorry.
No, I think you guys hit it all for sure. Yeah. It is a matter of aesthetics. What makes you, what's pleasing for you as well.
So I looked around and a lot of our native plants will spread, but if we're thinking of something that spreads to the point that it falls off the sides of a container, was really tough for me as an ecologist to find stuff that matches this aesthetic. But I found a few. And one being creeping phlox. There are a couple of different species depending on where you are located. I have the one that's most native to southern New England listed. And last week we went over vines that maybe it could, where there are examples, including at some of our schoolyard habitat sites, where the trumpet honeysuckle and the trumpet vines are actually rooted in a container, and then they have the structure to grow up as a vine outside of that container. And then there are some other small plants that could be considered ground covers that might also be able to spill out if you're going to keep a container for a longer amount of time. So the first is a native small phlox. Some people nickname it the moss phlox or a pink phlox or moss pink. And it can be quite shade tolerant, which is a nice factor that we don't always have native plants, and especially blooming flowers that can that are anything beyond May 1st or May 15th. So this is a midsummer bloom, and what I love about it is that it just grows as a small, shorter plant. I'm gonna consider getting some of this for my steep backyard because it is pretty shady, and I'm looking for a permanent ground cover. So I might try this on a larger than container basis. It was also nice to find something that wasn't just a filler, but something that was going to have bright colors as a possibility as well. We talked about trumpet honeysuckle and trumpet vines last week. The honeysuckle blooming in the summer and earlier summer usually, and the trumpet vine blooming later into the summer. The idea though here that is a concern for you considering this as a container plant is that the spread is not in inches like most of the other fillers that we've mentioned, but in feet per year. And I grabbed a example that can be used in many different ways. This is a 3-tooth cinquefoil, which is native to our trap rock ridges. So it's native to our to the northeast, and there's other species across the country of cinquefoils. They love full sun, but this one in particular can tolerate a partial shade, and it can grow where there's good drainage. It doesn't do well if it's very wet there, but it can grow short, and it definitely grows by rhizomes because a effectively, this is like a wild strawberry, which there are wild strawberry species I could have listed here as well. This one I found interesting is that it also has a stem that turns red in the fall, if it's in the full sun. And that's because red coloration in the foliage is because of an excess of sugars. So it needs the sun for that red color to happen. But that's an interesting choice. It grows really well if you're considering a rock garden situation. Another one I can consider for my steep, rocky backyard. But the idea that we have something that grows in one small, we buy it as a small plant, and it can grow by up to 2 feet in one season. This is a great plant that might spill over the area you originally planted it in, is why I thought of this idea. There were a couple of quick questions that came up here because I threw some definitely interesting ideas out there. So I'm going to let the gardener speak up a little bit more on my suggestions.
Peter mentioned grasses growing up through the phlox are a pain on a bigger scale if you don't keep up with your weeding. I have found that to be true of so many things. Definitely keep up with your weeding. With phlox or otherwise, you can get out of control. And Peter also says, I guess I'll have to scale my phlox down to a container, and that might be more my speed. I've seen some really beautiful, like I've seen people use only phlox in their containers, and it's really lovely how it can just spill over the edge of the containers. So I like that idea, and feel free to take a picture when you do it and share it with us. That'd be awesome. And Danielle asked, how do you control the honeysuckle?
So for some of these spillers and a few of the fillers, the taller grasses, pruning might be in order. And that is certainly something that honeysuckle being a woody vine, pruning is certainly a way that you can control it. And this is a native honeysuckle. There's also the idea that we have some bush honeysuckles that are not native to the area. That's a different type of control method in your backyard. I don't know if that's what Danielle's actually asking about, because yeah, the idea of invasives is another whole challenge there.
That is the one that she was asking about.
Yes, that. Cutting it back, obviously, is the first thing with any of the woody vegetation. And if you can pull the root systems out, that usually needs for large bushes like that, usually requires machinery to be able to make that happen. And then there are some cases where cutting and then applying a herbicide straight to the stump is the one other way, so we limit the amount of herbicide that's used, is a control method that's actually recommended in certain situations for that.
Danielle's added on to that a shovel and a pickaxe. That's true. I was actually thinking about my spade, about whether or not my I forget what it's called now. I call it my pitchfork, but it's not a pitchfork. You'll know what I'm talking about because I talked about it last week.
Anita will correct us again.
Thank you, Anita, in advance. That I was thinking that could also help, but I guess it would depend on how big the honeysuckle had gotten, how established it was. And I thought I saw another. So Sharon B asked, can you plant honeysuckle in a large coffee can in the dirt to restrict it? That's an interesting question. I think that you probably could. I don't know that. I haven't found native honeysuckle to be very aggressive. I also haven't found it to be very fast growing. But that's just been my experience. You could definitely try it. I think a lot of things with native plants, especially for containers, is trial and error. Seeing what works for you, because what works for you might not work for somebody else's garden. Yeah.
And Nita has asked, is Weigela native? She has two of them that are quite old, but the hummingbirds and orioles absolutely love them. And they're looks like they're coming to the end of their lifespan. So I bet you she's asking whether she should replace them as the same species or consider some other new, more native plant as the replacement. I just quickly searched it, and they're native to Eastern Asia, that there aren't any of that genus that are native to North America, especially to our region. So a lot like butterfly bush, it might not be a plant that is invasive per se, but it's not native. So while it's got blooms that provide nectar, and that's a great function, it is not probably supporting any of our host. It's not a host plant for many of our insects, for our caterpillars. So to have that added benefit, we could find native things like some of our native azaleas are blooming at the same exact time, and would also have native butterflies that they're more connected to. Any other questions there, Jillian?
Yes. Elizabeth is, oh, actually, before I get to Elizabeth's question, Anita says, thanks, Ken. Great excuse to use that spot for maybe a viburnum. A viburnum would be a great addition to add there. And Elizabeth asked, is Centaurea native?
I'm wondering if Leslie knows that off the top of her head, because I'm not familiar with that as a native genus myself.
Yeah, I was just double checking. I didn't think so. And I also did a quick check of it. As long as we're talking about Centaurea montana, it's not.
Yeah.
It is endemic to Europe. Yeah, so that Centaurea is not native. It's pretty.
Mm-hmm.
Not helping out our insects. I actually have not seen anybody use it much in the garden either, like the hummingbirds or anything. Maybe I just haven't seen that.
In addition to the plant list that we share and going through the native plant database, I just shared in the chat, and I will include it in the email that we send out as well, the Connecticut invasive species list. So if you have questions, if for some reason you're like, okay, this plant isn't showing up in the database, but is it at least native to North America, or is it at least not aggressive, not invasive? If you do want to check to see if a particular species that you have or are interested in is invasive, this is a great resource to go and see. And I found a link for New York State as well that I can share. Theirs is not listed as a PDF, it's just like on the website, but Connecticut has theirs as a PDF that you can print out with you and take to your native plant nursery when you're shopping around.
So I don't see a first name, so I can't say exactly who shared this, but somebody's sharing about one of my first planters in my parents' yard as a teen was a big old bathtub, and it can provide a different aesthetic, and it's reusing different materials. So if you've got a fun one to be able to include of a different style of container, it worked really well because it can be deeper. And then, yes, it could support things like even having a trellis over it. So you could have your vines started in there. And that might be also one that it's deep enough that the frost cycles through it wouldn't damage the root systems of any of our native plants. So we've had a few times people comment, and Jillian just referred again, that we will be sharing a list of links to where we read and where we got our suggestions for some of these container garden plants. And it will also be including both recordings, last week's and this week's. Will come out together in an email probably, I hope, by the end of tomorrow. But I did finally, after all my activity on Zoom, I finally got emails that Zoom is going to start deleting my recordings if I keep them there. So we're working on a YouTube folder that will be just for us that have registered for these workshops, that you'll get the links to these, and then that way they won't also be deleted on us in 6 weeks or something like that. So we want to make sure that you'll be able to have access to all that to refer back to it afterwards. So we won't be able to pull that together for you. I apologize that we couldn't share last week's recording already, but as I was about to send it, I realized I'm gonna have to move it anyway. So let's make sure we have the correct links that you won't have to worry about finding it somewhere else in the future. So Jillian, back over to you. You wanna take the sharing back over?
Sure thing. Okay. Sorry. Can y'all see my screen? No?
Not yet.
Okay.
There we go. Just
So we were trying to think about some good practical homework for y'all. I know we didn't really give you any homework this past week, but we would like for y'all to actually go in and use the native plant database and send us by email. You can either send it to myself or Ken, Kate, or Leslie. I believe we have all of our email addresses. And if you don't, I'll also type it here in the chat. So I'll make sure it's in the email that we send out as well. Okay. If you could let us know by Friday a native plant that you are planning to add to your outdoor space and what bird you're hoping that it will attract. And if it's, I want to challenge everybody to use something that, or to try to find something new that you're like, oh, I didn't know about that one, or I don't have that one in my yard yet. And your budget. Peter, you're cracking me up. Peter asked what their budget is. Your budget is whatever your real life budget is that you can provide for yourself. And let us know what plant you would like to have. That would be awesome. We might be able to include them in our presentation next week. Not all of them, but maybe we can include some of them. Did anybody have any questions for us, just based off of the presentation that y'all wanted to add? I see we've got a little bit of extra time for questions.
And if we didn't mention your favorite plant that you might consider for a container, feel free to ask whether you would consider it for container situations. Some of them we didn't feel work well with other plants or would do well with the varying conditions of being in a container. Or I also left a few plants off our suggested list so far because I know that I'm going to be discussing them with their seasonality, or Jillian's going to be discussing them in the terms of how they create structure for birds to look more like the habitat they're hoping for. So we did temper our list a little bit for this week.
Just making sure that I'm unmuted. Okay. Oh, great. Y'all have questions coming in. I see one from, let's see, our Gobil. Pardon me if I'm not saying your name correctly. I asked about plants that tolerate shade. Yes, we have some great shade plants that we can tell you about. Ken highlighted the creeping phlox. Creeping phlox also does really well in sun. So it's a flexible plant. So I definitely highlight that one. And then Dutchman's breeches are shade tolerant. They're native. They look like I think they look a little bit like bleeding heart in a way that there's multiple like dropping flowers, except they're white and they're a little bit more upright. I can include a photo of that for next week. I believe the scientific name is Dicentra cucularia or culcularia. That is another one that really likes shade. They also call that one, I think, maybe squirrel corn, or no, that's the one that's kind of densest. But I have noticed that squirrels do like to munch on that one. So you may want to try the kitty litter or cayenne pepper if you go down that route. And also chelone, turtlehead, white turtlehead is another one that is shade tolerant. That's chelone glabra that is native to Connecticut. And Ken touched on our ferns. Those are usually really shade tolerant. I personally really like maidenhair fern. And I'm trying to think if there's another one off the top of my head. There's also a euchera, I think that it might be heuchera, but I think it's euchera that's native as well. I think it's called coral bells is the common name for it. That is also a shade tolerant plant. So you could check those out. And they're so pretty. They're beautiful, especially in the fall. I love coral bells. Okay, let's see.
Great.
And Joanne asked, I just lost the question, any type of potting soil or ingredients best to look for? I would honestly just say to try doing a regular, well-balanced one in terms of nutrient. If you're doing something where you need like a succulent or something like that, you don't want to have very many nutrients in it. But especially because it is in a container, it's going to be a lot more stress. I know somebody asked earlier if container gardens lasted as long as if you planted the plants in the ground. I think there's a lot more room for error. So I just will inherently say, that they probably won't last as long. If you're caring for them very well, though, they can last a long time. You definitely will have to fertilize them a bit more just because they won't have the inputs that your regular soil in your yard would have of earthworms breaking down things and the minerals and how soil works. So definitely get a good potting soil to put in your container and continue to add mulch to keep that moisture level up and fertilize your plants. Careful not to over fertilize. Did you have any, sorry, I don't want to take over all the questions. Did you have anything to add to that, Ken or Leslie?
No, I think that's good. That's good. You covered it.
I was going to address Sharon B's question of what about transplanting natives that are found around the area? Not to raid the natural areas, but are there any natives that work well transplanting? The fact that they are perennials make them easier in the concept of transplanting. It's really only legal to do that on your own property, but not beyond that you can't go to any local open spaces and take native plants out to take back for your own use. Is not allowed anywhere that I'm aware of. So it would be from your own spaces to be able to move it. And it's the same idea of other perennial ornamentals is that you'd be splitting. So as long as you're taking enough of the roots around the base of the plant to start in some of that initial soil that is already with it, and consider those conditions, then you could do it on your own property, but not beyond that.
There also, I just wanted to touch on in terms of that there are also better times of day. Like if you do it earlier in the morning or in the evening, it's less stressful on the plant if you do have a native plant in your area that you're wanting to move somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Right, because we have done that with our own native gardens that one schoolyard habitat had grown enough of their plants that become well established over multiple years, and they were splitting them as if they were other ornamental perennials, and they were splitting them and we were moving them to another schoolyard habitat. But again, it was within one property owner, the city of New Haven. It was their property, so that's why that was allowed to be able to move it from one place to another. Any other questions in there? I'm scrolling along and have some other private conversations going on myself.
Sure. There's a question from, let's see. Walker. I would like to add some native plants to the rear of my yard. They would need to grow bigger, tolerate shade, and be deer resistant. Any suggestions? Off the
That is a
top
tall
of my
order. So I did respond to Walker that our fourth week is going to be about bigger scale, thinking of adding your plants together as a community so that it creates structure for what the birds want to consider as home, not just that there's a couple of plants that they might like or some of their food might be there as a buffet, but that it really looks like what they consider a home habitat. And that's where your plants might come into play. That might be the best suggestions for you there. If you are in anywhere west of the Connecticut River, I would highly suggest going to Earth Tones in Woodbury. Would be one of the first places to choose. That they do have a big selection of shade tolerant plants. And also if you happen to be more towards New Haven, Nature Works is just east of New Haven. Both of them I know are working on a curbside selection, so that I think they have a pretty tolerant staff of discussing things by phone and by email with you to make the right choices for you for that site specificness that you might have.
We have another question from Synth, and it is, what is the best or easiest way to change a small area of lawn to native plants? That's a great question. The schools that I've worked with who have installed schoolyard habitat have had to take out huge chunks of their lawns, and a lot of them will actually keep cardboard and the layer. I mean, it's not a very attractive thing to do, but it works seasonally. If you do this in the winter time, or even in spring, you could do this. You put down cardboard to shade out that grass, and you leave it down. I want to say they left theirs down for maybe 2 or 3 months, and they were able to get the sod out of their area. I know some people will also use like a weed barrier or black plastic and put that over. You can do that. If you don't mind using, your muscles, you can always just like dig it up, especially if it is a small area. But there are easier ways than digging it up. And I would recommend either doing a plastic barrier over it or layering the cardboard, and I can't remember if they use compost or soil. I think they just use soil and then more cardboard and a little bit more soil just to make it nice and thick, and it'll take care of it.
That is a tough question because removing all of it manually seems like a great possibility that might be a little bit faster. But then once you have loose soil, you've woken up the seed bank that might be there of other non-native plants that you probably don't want to start your nursery with, your new little meadow with as well. So, and if it's a reasonable size space, I would recommend trying to use plugs rather than seed. Would make it so that your plants are able to establish themselves a little bit quicker, not just for adding color, but also to be able to outcompete those non-natives that are the weeds, the true weeds, keep them out of your area.
Yes, I'd add to that. I don't remember where I saw this, but I saw this and like, it's true. Nature does not like bare soil. It will find something to do with it. Either an invasive will pop up there, a native will pop up there. It'll cover it with leaves from the trees. Unfortunately, sometimes litter will be there, but it doesn't like to just be bare. So I just want to second what Ken was saying in terms of if you do remove it, something else could potentially grow in there. So be prepared to act quickly to get things in the ground there, and mulch, definitely mulch.
And one more question further back, Danielle was asking, how long should you plan in years to have bushes to fill in spaces and begin to provide natural food sources for birds year round? That answer could be a little with how large did you purchase it to begin with, of course. Because we have some that it's actually a condition of how much we're pruning them and then how much they grow back every year. For example, ones near our demonstration garden at the Audubon bent of the river in the bird feeder section, we're cutting back some of those dogwoods to knee high, and they grow back to 6 feet in usually about a year. So some of these woody plants will grow back to their full potential fairly quickly. But out of our other plantings at other partners, it's usually a 2 to 3 year process, and they will start blooming even in their second year quite often, so that they're providing some flowers and some berries. And then depending on your space and how you nurture them, then they will truly fill in spaces and become a hedgerow for you, or whichever way that you want to consider them, into a dense thicket or as a hedgerow. There's multiple ways that they'll grow after that point. But yes, in 2 to 3 years, I would say, unless Leslie's got a different idea.
No, 2 to 3 years probably is once they get established. It's going to take them that long to do it. They'll have a few berries or flowers in the first couple of years, but 2 to 3 years, they'll really start to take off.
And 2 new questions. Deborah's asking any plant suggestions for attracting snakes, spiders, and frogs or salamanders. I think it's the elements of water and whether you have that condition, and then the plants that are more wetland friendly or wetland obligate species, then we would recommend something different there. I'd have to think about a specific plant that certain spiders might prefer, and the answer is going to come more in the end of the structure. What does it look like and how dense the branches are together that they're going to want cover, not specific plants.
Yeah, it's really the dampness.
I've even seen images of people that will have their container garden, and they'll have some sort of like little water area within their container that I've seen, like a little frog hiding out in their container. So you can definitely have other visitors other than birds that you're helping to support. And especially with the plants that we have, you're going to be attracting some insects. So they will come as long as there's water there for them. That's a big sticking point for them.
And then Sharon has a fun question. Maybe not in a container, but what about nettles?
Ooh. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, nettles are actually really good in the garden. They're really bad for your ankles and arms, but they're very good. They do attract. I'm trying very hard to remember. There are some butterflies, and I don't remember which ones. I don't know if you do, Ken, that love the nettle flowers. So they are valuable. There's a lot of insects. They are native, but they are really painful. So yeah, wouldn't put them in the containers.
Yeah, I would qualify them as, I don't know if I would purchase them ever, but I would certainly let the volunteers grow where it's okay for me. They are, stinging nettles in particular, are a host plant for 20 plus species of butterflies in Connecticut alone. Some of them, like our red admirals, are almost obligate to stinging nettles and only 1 or 2 other species. So it's really valuable for some of our plants. And then also the commas and question mark butterflies. The only place I've been able to find their caterpillars have been on stinging nettles. I know they use other host plants, but for me, that's the one at my height I can find the caterpillars actually. Great. thank you for these great questions. I know they weren't exactly about containers, but I'm glad we had this little bit of extra time tonight to be able to answer those other things just going on in people's minds. So we will address the videos and all the handouts. I'm going to take our slides from tonight and just convert them to a PDF so you get all those notes. I know a lot of you, I could see the video, those of you with video, were taking notes tonight, but we'll pass those along so that you have them. It might not be in a full, neat list for you, but at least you know where to reference them in the future. And thank you. I did have a couple of typos from typing in the Latin names a little bit too quickly this afternoon. So we will make sure those are correct so that way your nursery staff do not laugh at your requests when you get there. That was not our intent. And thanks. Thank you for joining us on another beautiful evening. I know you could have been doing plenty of other things, but I hope this will enrich your birding in your backyards in the future. Thanks. Thanks, Jillian.
Thanks,
Thanks, Leslie, for helping
everybody.
tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Thanks, Leslie. Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Bye.
Looking forward to seeing you all next week.